On that humid Monday morning, Christina could no longer hide the pain tearing through her body. For weeks her body had been sounding alarms, low-grade fevers in the evenings, chills, nausea, loss of appetite. But every time she tried to talk to Eric about it, she was met with the same cold, dismissive look, as if she were making it all up. He told her it was stress, that she was becoming paranoid, that she needed to stop being so dramatic. His mother, always nearby and eager to weigh in, only made things worse, insisting that young women invent illnesses just to get attention. Christina started to believe she might be overreacting and kept pushing through the pain as her condition silently deteriorated. The night before everything fell apart, Christina made one more attempt to be heard. She sat beside her husband on the couch and told him, her voice trembling, that the pain was intensifying, that she felt something serious was happening inside her. Eric didn't respond right away. He simply stood up, picked up his phone and left the room, saying he had important calls to take. He slept in their bedroom as if nothing had happened, while Christina lay awake all night, her abdomen throbbing and her body soaked in sweat. At 5 a.m, unable to stand, she collapsed in the hallway and dialed emergency services. When the paramedics arrived, they found her barely conscious. Eric remained upstairs, asleep, and never came down as his wife was taken away in the ambulance. At the hospital, the diagnosis was immediate and urgent, a ruptured appendix that had already led to a severe infection. Christina was rushed into emergency surgery with a dangerously high fever and signs of early sepsis. As the medical team prepared her for the operating room, one of the nurses tried contacting her emergency contact, Eric. The response came through as a cold 4-word text: "Business dinner. Handle it." There were no follow-up questions, no sign of concern. Christina was wheeled into surgery alone, her body weak, her heart even weaker. The physical pain was immense, but the emotional abandonment carved deeper. In the moments before the anesthesia took hold, she wasn't thinking about survival. She was trying to understand how the person she had shared 6 years of marriage with could be so absent, so indifferent. The surgery was long but successful. Christina remained sedated for hours before regaining consciousness. When she finally opened her eyes in the recovery room, disoriented and aching, she instinctively looked around for Eric. There was no one, no flowers, no messages, no familiar face waiting for her. Over the next 24 hours, doctors and nurses checked in regularly, but Eric never showed up, not even a call. It was as if she had vanished from his life the moment she became inconvenient. The realization settled slowly, painfully. She had gone through a life-threatening emergency completely alone, and the man she had once believed would protect her in sickness had chosen to disappear at the very moment she needed him most. By the 3rd day in the hospital, Christina had stopped checking her phone. She knew there would be nothing. The silence from Eric was deafening, but also strangely clarifying. Nurses occasionally asked if her husband was planning to visit, and she'd answer with a forced smile and a quiet, "He's busy with work." The truth was uglier, but she wasn't ready to say it out loud. Not yet. Her body was still weak, her stitches tight and sore, but inside something had started to shift. The pain that once felt like rejection now felt like proof. Proof that she hadn't been imagining things all these years. The emotional distance, the coldness, the way she was always made to feel like the problem. It had all been real. And now she had lived through his absence in the most brutal, undeniable way. On the 4th morning, a nurse walked in, holding a plain white envelope. "Someone left this for you," she said, placing it on the bedside table before walking out. Christina frowned. There was no name on it, no sender. She hesitated for a moment, then opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, there was a folded letter, a photograph, and what looked like legal documents. The letter began with a name she didn't recognize at first: Skylar Bennett. As Christina read on, her breath caught. Skylar explained that she had once been married to Eric, that she had also collapsed with a medical emergency and had been abandoned by him. Christina's eyes filled with tears as the words unfolded. Skylar wasn't dead, as Eric had once implied. She had been alive, recovering in silence, and now she had found Christina, just in time. The photo inside the envelope was grainy but unmistakable. Skylar in a hospital bed, pale and hooked up to machines, looking exactly how Christina imagined she must have looked just days earlier. Alongside it, the documents outlined power of attorney transfers, insurance claims, and property. Reallocations, actions Eric had taken while Skylar was still barely conscious. He had legally declared her mentally incompetent, moved assets to his name, and within a year, married Christina. The timeline hit like a punch to the gut. Everything Christina thought she knew about her marriage, the romantic gestures in the beginning, the sudden move to a new house, the way Eric never liked talking about his past, it all began to make sense. Skylar had been the tragedy he never wanted to discuss. But she wasn't a ghost. She was real, alive and trying to save someone from the same fate. Christina sat in silence for nearly an hour after reading the letter, the papers still spread across her lap. Her heart raced, but her body remained still. It was too much to process at once. The betrayal wasn't just emotional anymore, it was systemic, calculated. Eric hadn't just stopped loving her, he had followed a pattern, a method. What chilled her the most wasn't even the abandonment, it was the eerie precision of it all. He had done this before. He had already rehearsed this cruelty on someone else, and now that someone had found her, reached out and offered a lifeline. For the first time in days, Christina felt something she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't alone. And this wasn't over. The next day, Skylar made contact again, this time through a phone call. Her voice was steady, clear, but carried the weight of someone who had lived through something unthinkable. She asked if Christina was feeling strong enough to talk. Christina, still recovering but emotionally alert now, agreed. For nearly an hour, the two women shared pieces of a puzzle that neither had been able to complete alone. Skylar told her about the sudden seizure she'd had years ago, how Eric had responded with eerie calm, how quickly the paperwork moved to declare her unfit. She explained how she woke up months later in a rehab facility, disoriented and with no legal access to her own life. And slowly, painfully, she had put things together. What drove her forward was the thought that Eric might do it again, this time to someone else. Skylar hadn't just survived. She had gathered evidence, and she wasn't alone either. Riley Morrison, her best friend since college, was now a high-powered attorney with a reputation for dismantling corporate empires and for not missing. Riley had helped Skylar rebuild everything step by step, and now they had a plan. It wasn't about revenge. It was about exposure, protection, justice. Riley was already moving in Christina's direction under the radar. In fact, she had already begun making contact with Eric, posing as someone he had met at a conference, someone who understood his ambition and his lonely genius. Christina listened to all of it, stunned but alert. A fire had started to burn beneath the exhaustion. She realized she had a choice to make. Let this pass and continue being erased, or stand up, guided now by someone who had once been where she was lying now. In the following days, while Christina remained in the hospital recovering, Riley made rapid progress. Her background in financial law gave her the perfect cover to get close to Eric. He believed he was charming her, impressing her with his influence and network. What he didn't know was that every dinner, every text, every slip of arrogance was being documented. Riley used the same tools Eric had once used against Skylar: legal language, strategic silence, and timing. Within 2 weeks, she had obtained limited power of attorney over one of his shell companies. It was enough to begin freezing assets and pulling financial records. Meanwhile, Christina stayed in contact with both women, slowly regaining her strength and clarity. The fog that had surrounded her for years, the doubt, the confusion, the subtle emotional bruises, was finally lifting. When Christina was discharged from the hospital, she didn't go home. She went to a temporary apartment Skylar had, arranged through a friend, far from the city and far from Eric. There, surrounded by silence that wasn't cold but peaceful, she began piecing herself back together. She reviewed documents with Riley, saw photos Skylar had kept, and began to fully understand the scale of Eric's manipulation. There were offshore accounts, forged signatures, emails that painted her as unstable in case she ever acted out. The level of control he had planned for was chilling. But now, with Riley's precision and Skylar's determination, Christina wasn't a victim lost in the storm. She was at the center of a strategy, a movement, a quiet war for her own dignity. Eric, of course, had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. He still believed Christina was recovering somewhere, likely sulking or learning her lesson, as he once phrased things when she dared to question him. In his mind, he was already free to continue playing the grieving husband in public, the genius in control in business, and the victim in private. But Riley had timed everything down to the hour. Within a single morning, she submitted legal filings to freeze multiple accounts under Eric's name, issued inquiries into asset transfers, and served notice of Christina's intention to contest marital assets on grounds of fraud and abandonment. By the time Eric tried to access his primary account, it was already too late. The damage was in motion, and this time, it wasn't silent. The confrontation didn't happen in a courtroom or through screaming matches. Christina didn't want drama, she wanted truth. It took place in a neutral office under legal supervision. Eric arrived smug, clearly expecting an emotional plea or a failed negotiation. But when he walked in and saw both Riley and Christina seated, with thick folders of documentation and calm expressions, the mask started to crack. Riley led the meeting with ruthless clarity. She listed the fraud, the abandonment, the concealed assets, and, most damning, Skylar's testimony and medical records. Eric tried to interrupt, deflect, even laugh it off, but every time Christina remained composed. That was the part he hadn't expected. She wasn't broken. She wasn't begging. She was watching him fall, and she wasn't moving a muscle to stop it. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift and merciless. Eric lost his position at the firm after internal audits, quietly triggered by Riley, revealed irregularities in company spending and potential conflicts of interest. His accounts remained frozen while investigations progressed, and several of his trusted colleagues began distancing themselves as the truth leaked in fragments through legal filings and anonymous tips. He tried to reach out to Christina once, sending a short message that read more like a warning than an apology. "You don't know what you've done." She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. The silence that once hurt now protected her. Each ignored message was a wall going up between her and the man who had nearly erased her. Meanwhile, Christina moved forward, slowly but with intention. Her body healed before her mind did, but both began to recover with time and distance. She started therapy, not because someone told her to, but because she wanted to understand why she had accepted so little for so long. She learned about gaslighting, emotional neglect, trauma bonds, terms that made her cry, not because they were technical, but because they explained everything she had lived without the words to describe. She reconnected with old friends, people Eric had quietly isolated her from. She picked up her old hobby of painting again, even enrolled in a local class. Life wasn't easy, but it was hers again. That, above all, was what mattered. Skylar and Christina met in person for the first time 2 months after the surgery. They chose a quiet cafe by the coast, neutral, open, and far from the noise of everything they had endured. Christina wasn't sure what to expect. She had imagined Skylar 1,000 different ways, fragile, bitter, guarded. But when she arrived, Skylar stood up with a soft smile and eyes that had clearly seen too much. There was no awkwardness, no pity, just a silent understanding between two women who had survived the same man, the same manipulation, and nearly the same fate. They talked for hours, filling in blanks, comparing timelines, even laughing at the sheer absurdity of some of Eric's lies. What should have been a painful meeting turned into something healing. There was strength in not being the only one. From that day forward, they kept in touch regularly. Skylar had become something more than an ally. She was proof that survival didn't have to mean silence. Together, with Riley still handling the legal battlefield, they formed a kind of triangle. One rebuilding, one recovered, one protecting. Riley never demanded attention for what she did. She worked in the background, relentless and sharp, but always made sure Christina felt safe and in control. With their help, Christina didn't just escape a toxic marriage, she dismantled it piece by piece. What Eric had built through years of manipulation crumbled not in a storm of rage, but in the quiet, careful work of three women who refused to be erased. And that was what made it powerful. Eric, now a shadow of the man he once projected to the world, tried to recover some form of his old life, but the damage was too deep. His name was attached to ongoing legal inquiries, his reputation in the business world was tainted, and the network of people who once surrounded him had thinned to almost nothing. He attempted to spin his story to a few contacts, blaming vengeful women and a misunderstanding, but no one was buying it. Screenshots, recordings, and documentation had already made their rounds. Riley had been meticulous. By the time Eric realized how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered, there was no path left to reclaim. He wasn't just defeated, he was irrelevant. And for someone like him, that was the worst kind of punishment. Christina, on the other hand, didn't chase a spotlight. She didn't post long rants or victory speeches. Her life became quieter, more intentional. She changed her last name back to her maiden name and updated it on every document, every account, as a way of reclaiming what had been hers before Eric's control. She donated her old wedding ring to a women's shelter auction. She gave away every piece of furniture he had picked out. Her new space was small but full of light, books on every shelf, music playing low in the evenings, fresh paint drying on canvases near the windows. She wasn't trying to become someone new. She was finally remembering who she had been before someone tried to convince her she was nothing. There were hard days, of course, days when the scars felt fresh again, like when she'd hear a voice that sounded like his, or when a smell brought her back to the sterile hospital room, where everything changed. Healing wasn't linear. Sometimes she questioned herself, not about leaving, but about how she had stayed for so long. But therapy helped. So did Skylar, who always knew exactly what to say without needing many words. And Riley, who checked in every so often, not as a lawyer, but as someone who genuinely cared. The three women stayed bound not by what broke them, but by how they refused to stay broken. Christina knew she was lucky to have them. Most women in her place never got a warning, never got a letter, never got a second chance. One afternoon, nearly a year after it all began, Christina visited the courthouse to finalize the last of the legal proceedings. It wasn't dramatic, just a signature and a quiet moment of closure. She stepped outside into the sunlight, papers in hand, and felt a strange calm settle over her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. What she felt was control. Not over Eric, not over the past, but over herself, finally. She walked home that day without rushing. She bought flowers on the way just because they looked beautiful. That evening, as she lit a candle and sat by the window with a warm cup of tea, she allowed herself to feel it fully. Peace. The kind she thought she'd never feel again. Months later, Christina received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a brief, typed message from Eric. No apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd done. Just a cold, vague statement about how things had gotten out of hand, and that he hoped she would move on without resentment. She read it once and set it aside. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. The letter was exactly what she expected from him. Detached, self-serving, meaningless. She didn't need closure from Eric. She had created her own. What once would have sent her into days of spiraling now felt weightless. He had no power left. That was the real ending, not the court ruling or the asset division, but the moment she read his words and felt absolutely nothing. Instead of responding, Christina took a walk. It was a crisp afternoon and she followed a path through a nearby park she had never explored before. As she walked, she thought about all the versions of herself she had lost along the way. The girl who had been gaslighted into silence, the woman who had begged to be believed, the wife who had collapsed alone in her hallway. But she also thought about the woman she was now, the one who chose herself every day, who said no without guilt, who trusted her instincts again. She had rebuilt from rubble, and the foundation this time was unshakable. Christina didn't need revenge. She didn't need validation. What she had, finally, was freedom, and that was enough. Not long after, Christina was invited by a local women's organization to speak at a private event. Skylar had referred her, mentioning that her story might help others who were still trapped in silent battles. Christina hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't her thing, and the idea of sharing something so personal with strangers made her stomach tighten. But something told her it mattered. On the night of the event, she stood in front of a small room filled with women of all ages. Some cried as she spoke. Others nodded quietly, as if her words were finally putting names to feelings they had buried for years. Christina didn't hold back. She told the truth, not just about what Eric did, but about what it took to find herself again. The fear, the guilt, the loneliness, and the strength that came after. Afterward, several women came up to thank her. One, maybe in her 50s, hugged her tightly and whispered, "I thought I was the only one." That moment stayed with Christina. It reminded her that survival doesn't always mean walking away. It also means turning around and reaching for the next hand behind you. She kept in touch with the organization, volunteering here and there, sharing resources and stories, never pushing too hard, just being present. Helping others heal helped her continue healing too. The trauma didn't vanish, but it stopped defining her. What defined her now was something else entirely: courage, clarity, and connection. The kind that only comes from surviving the storm and choosing day after day to step back into the light. A year and a half after the surgery, Christina received a postcard. It was from Riley, sent from a remote village in Greece, where she'd taken a rare vacation. On the back, in her sharp handwriting, she wrote, "We did good. Take care of that piece of yours. It's rare and hard-earned." Christina smiled, holding the card for a long time before placing it on her fridge with a magnet shaped like a paintbrush. It felt symbolic somehow. One piece of her past, one from her present, side by side. She thought about everything Riley had done, not for attention, not for applause, but because she believed in what was right, and because women like her, Skylar, and now Christina, knew that silence only serves the ones who harm. They had changed the story, and that mattered. Later that week, Christina finally opened a new email account, completely separate from anything tied to Eric or her old life. It felt small, but significant. She used her middle name as her username, a name she'd always liked but never used. She signed up for a community art class and submitted one of her paintings to a local gallery's open call. She didn't care if it was accepted. It wasn't about being seen by others. It was about seeing herself again. Every small act of reclaiming space felt like another brick in the foundation of a new life. A life not defined by abandonment or betrayal or legal victories, but by joy, presence, and choice. This time, she was building it on her own terms. Skylar came to visit again that spring. They sat on Christina's small balcony, drinking tea and watching the sun dip behind the neighboring buildings. There wasn't much need for heavy conversation anymore. They had cried, together, strategized together, healed in overlapping waves. Now they talked about ordinary things: books, food, the strange comfort of quiet routines. At one point, Skylar looked around and said, "You made this place feel like a heartbeat." Christina didn't answer right away, but the words stayed with her long after the visit. Her home, her life, her peace. They had once all felt so far away. Now they were real, lived in, warm. She had always thought closure would come with confrontation. But it came here instead, in small, calm moments that no one could take from her. Christina never told the full story online, not in a blog post, not in a viral thread. But she shared pieces of it carefully in support groups and safe spaces where other women were beginning their own escape. She learned that survival doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it's just about showing up, telling the truth quietly, so someone else doesn't feel so alone in their doubt. She didn't claim to have all the answers, but she had experience and empathy, and a voice she had fought hard to reclaim. If someone asked what happened to her now, she wouldn't say she was abandoned on an operating table. She'd say she was given a second chance, by pain, by truth, and by two women who refused to let another life be stolen. There were still echoes of the past that surfaced now and then, a song that played in a cafe, a news headline that reminded her of court filings, a scent that took her back to the hospital hallway. But Christina no longer feared them. They were part of her, yes, but they didn't own her. She had stopped running from the memories and started coexisting with them. She didn't try to forget. She had learned that healing wasn't erasure, it was integration. It was waking up on a Sunday morning, making pancakes in her own kitchen, dancing barefoot to music she chose, and realizing that the life she had now wasn't a reaction to pain, but a result of her own design. She had planted roots in peace, and they were growing. She visited the old neighborhood once, more out of curiosity than nostalgia. The house where she and Eric had lived was for sale, empty, stripped of the polished life they used to fake. She stood across the street for a moment, watching it like a stranger. There was no anger, no longing, just distance, and a kind of quiet gratitude that she had made it out before the walls could close in forever. On the walk back to her car, she passed a young couple arguing, on the sidewalk. The woman had tears in her eyes, her voice low but sharp. Christina didn't stop or stare, but something inside her ached with recognition and hope, because she knew now, more than ever, that people can leave and they can rebuild. Years from now, if someone were to ask Christina what changed her life, she wouldn't say it was the surgery or even the betrayal. She would say it was the moment she realized she deserved more, even if no one else was willing to give it to her. That quiet shift, born out of abandonment and pain, became the force that carried her forward. It taught her that sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who seem the safest, and that real safety comes from knowing yourself well enough to walk away when no one else believes you should. She had gone from being the woman left behind in a hospital bed to the woman others turned to for strength, and she never took that for granted. Christina didn't chase a perfect ending. Life wasn't a movie, but she had reclaimed her story. She had survived being erased and then written herself back in, with love, with intention, with truth. On some evenings, as she stood by the window of her small apartment watching the city lights flicker, she thought about Skylar and Riley and all the silent women whose strength had changed the course of her life. She didn't need a spotlight, just peace, just clarity, just the quiet, steady knowledge that she had not only survived, but had chosen to live, fully, deeply, and freely. And that, in the end, was more powerful than any apology ever could be.